people can join as we proceed. Welcome everyone to this third session in the APORDE public seminar series for 2020. And we've had two very good sessions so far, and I'm sure that today will be equally interesting and successful. So my name is Ndikumana, and I am one of the course directors of APORDE, which is the African Program on Rethinking Development Economics. We have a whole team. My other course director is Saul Levine from TIPS, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. And today we have a panel with 3 speakers, and there will be time for discussion afterwards. It's the first of 2 panels on the social and economic responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And today our panel is entitled Africa's Economic Responses to COVID-19 Pandemic. We have 3 speakers that Saul will introduce, and what we will do is each speaker will make their input for 15 to 20 minutes. Please feel free to ask questions on the chat as we go along, and then we will take questions at the end. There will be some time for raised hands and questions and Q&A. All right, so I will just about a little bit about the panel. In terms of the background, from our perspective in South Africa, we know very well that both the economic and social policy responses to the COVID pandemic have been strongly contested. The country's economic policy response has brought into sharp focus the underlying debate on the role of the state, and particularly with respect to fiscal and monetary policy. What might be called the sound money view would say that it would be imprudent for the country to allow the government deficit to rise further in any circumstances. However, critics of this view have argued that South Africa is, quote, stuck in stabilisation with a cost controlling rather than a developmental state. In this view, the latest crisis provides just another manifestation that South Africa is stuck in a permanent economic emergency, where it's never allowed to make the expenditures and policy shifts necessary to address the country's deep-lying economic and social structural problems. So this panel will address these issues. We have 2 speakers who will largely focus on the South African situation, and we're also very pleased to have Léonce Ndikumana, who will touch on issues pertaining to the rest of the continent. But I will hand over to Saul now to introduce our speakers. Thanks, Saul.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who are in the Northern Hemisphere. We've got 3 speakers today. So our first speaker is Busi Sibeko. She's an economist and researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice, and she has a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Duke University and a Master's in Political Economy of Development from SOAS at the University of London. Her current research focus is on macroeconomic policy, including tax justice, fiscal and monetary policy, and participatory feminist budgeting to advance socio-economic rights. Busi provides research support to the Labour constituency at NEDLAC, and she also sits on the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition. She's co-authored The Cost of Austerity, Lessons for South Africa, and is co-author of A Fiscal Stimulus for South Africa. Our next speaker is Léonce Ndikumana, and he is a distinguished professor of economics and director of African Development Policy Program at the Political Economy Research Institute at University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's a member of the Independent Commission for Reform of International Corporate Taxation and a former member of the United Nations Committee on Development Policy. He served as Director of Research and Director of Operational Policies at the African Development Bank and also as an analyst at the United Nations Commission for Africa. Léonce is a graduate of the University of Burundi and has his doctorate from Washington University in Missouri. He's also an honorary professor of economics at the University of Cape Town and the University of Stellenbosch. Our next panelist is Duma Gqubule, and he is the founder of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation in Johannesburg. He spent the past 2 decades as a financial journalist, analyst, researcher, and advisor on issues of economic development and transformation. He was educated at Waterford Kambula in Swaziland and Aberdeen University in Scotland, where he has a master's degree in economics. He's worked as a financial journalist for several publications, and he also has worked for the Black Economic Empowerment Commission. He's co-authored several reports, including the BEE Commission's landmark report, which paved the way for the country's current Black economic empowerment laws and policy, and edited a book, Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, and Insights into Black Economic Empowerment. Thanks very much, and over to you, Nikki, to open the session.
Thank you, Saul. So the order of speakers, we will first call on Busi, and then followed by Léonce and Duma. So Busi, over to you for your input. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just bring up my slides. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me on this panel. So I thought that maybe in beginning my conversation that we should begin with the economic underpinnings for why we have seen the sorts of responses that we have seen in the South African context to COVID-19. And so I thought maybe we'd start a bit with the theoretical underpinnings that are still being permeated in the current moment. The first thing that I wanted to start with is to really look back to say that the current moment is really reflective of the orthodoxy in economic policy making, which has been undertaken over decades. And to start by saying, first of all, I know there's a difference between neoclassical economics and neoliberalism, and it's important to distinguish between the two, because neoclassical economics is sort of, the science, and neoliberalism is really about the political philosophy of how these neoclassical understandings of the economy are then implemented in a policy sense. And to say that in South Africa, we see a lot of this, and as we go through this presentation, you will understand why South Africa has responded in the way that it has to the current context, taking into account the neoclassical and the neoliberal underpinnings. The first is to acknowledge that neoclassical economics generally has really favored, limited fiscal deficit, trade openness, minimal state intervention, and so forth, getting prices right and so forth. And as we find ourselves in this moment where globally, everyone's debt is going to be increasing, it's important to remember that these are the underpinnings, and that there's a temptation to return to the way that we understand the economy. In terms of neoliberalism, this has been characterized by stabilisation, liberalization, privatization, and rationalization. And so, as we know, since the Bretton Woods institutions began, or that conference, we know that there's been a complete shift from state-led to market-led. And so across a lot of African countries, you can see that across time, there's been a decline in investment, particularly in socioeconomic investment, in health, in education, and so forth. Although the numbers have been increasing, but there's been sort of these pressures that attempt to leave some of these provisionings to the private market. And the private market, of course, has not been able to deliver at the scales that are needed in the continent to be able to deal with these needs that are needed in the economy and society. So as we know, there's been structural adjustment programs and stabilization programs across the continent. And even though South Africa was never formally a part of these programs, these policy logic, the logic around this policy is evident in the way that South Africa has implemented policy since 1994. And so with the structural adjustment programs, it's important to acknowledge that the programs from the World Bank, which have been focused on debt sustainability and growth, have been underpinned by a model called the Revised Minimum Standard Model, the RMSM, which has been really focused on the relationship between investment, growth, and debt. And therefore, we can see this relationship between credit ratings agencies and how we perceive of debt in the country and how we perceive of investment thereof and how the economy will grow. And with the IMF, there's been a strong focus on the POLAC model, which has been really about the balance of payments and the integrating of monetary income and balance of payments models generally. And so these have been critical in defining what kind of context we are in, and how we plan on moving forward has been deeply influenced by this. But importantly as well, our economic policies have been underpinned by what is called Homo economicus, which is the economic man. And when we think in neoclassical economics, I always remember of my Econ 101 class about Robinson Crusoe, about a man who's rational, self-interested, independent, and has no responsibilities to anyone. And really the focus of our economic policy from this macroeconomic sphere and microeconomic sphere has really separated private production from the market production. And what this has done is that, it focuses on productive labor and ignores reproductive labor, which is largely undertaken by women. And so because of this separation, we can see that most of our policies, and people will say, are gender blind, child blind, but really have been intersectionally blind to the needs of the people in a gendered and child way and intersectional way about our various ways in which we engage in the economy, which is not how Robinson Crusoe behaved in that particular setting. So because of all these policies over time and development, we have found ourselves, at least in the later part, well, there was austerity at the beginning of the 20th century, but there was a strong return to austerity late in the 20th century, and we saw a stronger response to, with austerity after the financial crisis. But what austerity has done, and austerity meaning the cutting of budgets during periods of low growth to address debt, really stems from this neoliberal, neoclassical understanding of the economy. And what austerity has been doing is had this desire to shrink social welfare and, to re-emphasize the neoliberal and neoclassical models that we've been seeing over time. And so debt has been also a very key component of this after the financial crisis in particular. And so right now, as we think about the way forward, debt is increasingly becoming a topic of large interest. And there's a lot of reports around we are going to be in a debt crisis after COVID-19. But really the understandings of debt come at this idea that government debt undermines business confidence, which again is part of that World Bank view around investment relationship to debt and therefore to growth, and come from this fiscal discipline sense of understanding of the economy. So with all of that theory and sort of the history, I think it's then critical to understand South Africa within this context. There's a great feminist political economist who always says how we talk about the current moment or how is reflective of how seriously we take the past. And I think in South Africa, it would be a grave mistake to talk about how we've responded without thinking about the economic theories and the underpinnings that influence how we are responding in this current moment. So as we know in South Africa, and I'll go briefly through this, is that since 1996, there's really been a move towards a stable macroeconomic environment, right? So low inflation, floating exchange rates, liberalizing the markets, increasing private, investment has been really the core of how our policies have been made. And in fact, they've been made in the spirit of neoliberalism, so to call it. And even though there's been these various attempts to change the narrative of South Africa, which has been one of really low growth, if you look at the historical tendencies, but also one where inequality has grossly grown over time. And so there's been these implementations of neoliberal policy. And in in the NDP, we can see the post-Washington consensus, which is when there's a realization that these neoliberal policies are actually increasing inequality. And so in South Africa, of course, now there's this increase around, how do we reduce poverty? And it's not a new phenomenon, it's always been there, but it's part of this framework. And effectively in the financial crisis in 2014-15 began implementing austerity policies. And in terms of austerity in South Africa, it has meant that despite their commitment to counter cyclical policies, what has happened is that we've seen a steady decline in socioeconomic investments, particularly in health and education. So it's very interesting that we find ourselves in a health pandemic while we look back at how we have systematically been underfunding health over the last couple of years. In fact, growth in terms of health spend has been slightly above population growth, even though we know that medical price inflation is higher than normal inflation. So over time, the absolute numbers have been growing in terms of how much we put into health expenditure. But what has really been happening is that there's been per capita expenditure declines. Similarly with education. In the medium term budget policy speech, it was stated that, or statement rather, that there would be declines on the budget of 5%, 6%, and 7%. And so this is how we have entered into this current moment. And given all these policy choices that South Africa has made, which are really underpinned by orthodoxy in economics, South Africa was already failing before we entered into this moment. We know that growth has trended downwards since 2010-11, averaging at 1.7%. There was obviously high unemployment, and obviously unemployment being the highest for Black women in South Africa. There was obviously inequality around gender, racial lines. We were already in a technical recession. And despite these efforts where they were really reining in and fiscally consolidating in health and education and all these other socioeconomic areas, debt was still increasing despite these efforts. And we already knew that there were a lot of people in South Africa who were living below the Stats SA poverty line. And so there were early warnings, as I've already stated, that we needed a sizable response, and that there was expectation that the economy would shrink between 7% and 10% at the time. Now this has been it's now 7.2% according to National Treasury, or the projection. We already knew early on that there'd be mass job losses, and that there would be a number of people who would go hungry. And so forth. So we really needed a sizable response that would be able to deal with these critical issues that we're facing in the economy. But most of all, we needed gender-aware policies. South Africa was one of the first few countries in the world to consider gender-responsive budgeting, but has since regressed, and we've never really implemented gender-responsive budgeting. And so when the COVID crisis came, we heard that the government would be implementing 500 billion as a response, which would be 10% of GDP to respond to the crisis. But what happened in the budget, and unfortunately, I'm going to only focus on fiscal policy. I know Duma will add on the monetary policy components and other elements. But in terms of fiscal policy, our amount of money that was invested towards the crisis was less than 1% of GDP, despite us expecting a 10% kind of stimulus. And so in effect, we did not really experience a stimulus. And South Africa really failed to do what internationally has worked during a crisis, which is to go early, go big, and go household. And we had a 500 billion package where majority of it was going towards business and so forth, as opposed to the household. So in terms of social security, it was evident that it was really evident that there was no consideration of social reproduction, particularly that is undertaken by Black women. Because when we saw the social security package, which was estimated at 50 billion, and then reduced to 41 billion, it was punitive to Black women, because it said that if you are a caregiver, then you do not qualify for a special COVID grant, which was a new introduction into the social security system. And so what would happen is that there was an increase or an introduction of a new social security, which was a caregiver grant, which we'd never had before. But having that caregiver grant meant that you are now excluded from the special unemployment grant. And so in that way, we argued as the Budget Justice Coalition and as the IEJ that it was punitive towards women who really in this time of crisis and also having the highest unemployment rates really needed the support that would be able to help them through the crisis. But not only that, there were already statistics that were showing that half of households were going hungry. And despite these efforts at Social Security, including the new grant, they were really not sufficient to ensure that people had the basic minimums, and by basic minimum meaning food, really on the table, if we're going to really say the basic minimum. But in addition to that, there was a complete failure to implement, and not complete, and not say 100%, but there was a failure to ensure that the funding reached the people who needed it most. But I'm pretty sure I'm probably going out of time. But I really want to just focus to say that the response package, which I won't go into in terms of line by line, but just to indicate that our response package and way forward that was proposed, which is austerity, was really a replica of the orthodox thinking that has been perpetuated over time. And that is where we've come from. And that is why our fiscal response to the COVID-19 crisis will not be sufficient to really help us to recover as an economy, but also it will not be sufficient in ensuring that the most vulnerable in our economy, which are Black women, particularly rural, are going to be able to come out of this crisis in a way that is really about protecting the human rights as the way that the Constitution has laid out. And so I will end there. There's obviously always many things to add about our response package itself, but I thought it would be very critical to really say that our response package is really underpinned by those theoretical understandings and why it is really failing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Busi. Thank you. That was great. And I think very useful to help us to understand where it is that we came from. And that gives us a much better insight into how this package was worked out and what it didn't do. I think from our point of view, we became very well aware of how the reprioritization of spending was impacting on other sectors of the economy, the education sector being one of them. But now I'd like to hand over to Léonce, and we're very happy to have you back at APORDE after so many years. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for thinking about me again. No, you have been thinking about me, but making it happen. It's going to be a challenge to follow on the previous presentation, which are very, very rich. I hope that Busi is writing up that into a paper or a book so we can actually get a chance to read it. It was very, very useful. My presentation will not be as specific because I want to look at the whole continent and how things have emerged. And because of limited time, of course, I won't have as much time to get into the specifics. But I hope I can give a general picture of where we are and where we came from, to understand the severity of the crisis and also think about what's going to happen down the road after the crisis. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it works.
That's perfect.
All right. So as I said, I will touch on a few things. One, starting from where we came from and why that matters in terms of thinking about the impact and also the way forward. Basically, this is a curve that shows you, a graph that shows you how the cases are evolving in the continent as a whole. And as you can see, the curve is really driven by what's happening in Southern Africa and mostly in South Africa. And the good news is that the curve is heading south, is heading down. But I would say that a word of caution first of all, the numbers are still high, the number of new cases. But also, given the limitation in terms of testing, these statistics are quite underestimating the actual number of cases that are happening across the country. The testing capacity is limited. I live in I'm told it's the most developed country in the world. And I can tell you, I see how difficult it is to get testing to reach all places. In some places, you still can't get tested unless you are sick. And even if you get tested, you don't get results quickly. By the time you get results, they are meaningless. So I can imagine that in many places in Africa, it must be very difficult to get tested quickly, which means that these numbers are very much underestimating the reality on the ground. So let's think about what was before the crisis. Before the crisis in Africa, there are some elements that I can call strength in the pre-crisis condition. One is that African countries that had been hit by public health crisis before have learned quite a bit in how to manage those crises, especially in things that you should avoid, including denying it. But also, as I'll show in a bit, there has been some initiative at the regional level and at the continental level to set up institutions and arrangements that help manage the pandemic that have come handy when the crisis hit. But the continent, most of the countries were facing important weaknesses that made it harder to manage the crisis and minimize the impact. One, which is still a big concern, is the weakness of the health health care systems. In my own country, for example, it appeared that the country was literally not prepared at all. In the whole country, there were 2 ventilators, which, as you can imagine, are not sufficient, and very few hospitals were prepared to accommodate the testing and treatment. We also facing very high poverty and inequality across the continent, which means that there is unequal access to health care, and the system has very low resilience to shocks. The other aspect of the weakness is the weak macroeconomic environment with high and accelerating debt levels. Already before the crisis, we were talking about a looming debt crisis and high budget deficit and a dependence on export of primary commodities and import of inputs, which means that once the global economy was hit by the shock, there was a shortage of decline in financial flows and decline in exports, demand and import, which made it harder for African economies to keep running functioning at the same pace. This picture is a summary of the conditions in the country. The usual twin deficits with high budget deficit and a high current account deficit, a shortage of domestic finance, domestic savings to meet investment demand, which pulls down growth, and rising public debt. This graph shows you the rising debt distress between 2015 and 2019. The number of countries in high debt distress or already in debt distress rose from 10 to 18. And this is a major concern because that means that the governments have no space to operate to finance fiscal stimulus. Again, even as the debt levels were accelerating, we have seen a decline in non-debt external capital inflows, mainly ODA, official development assistance, and private flows, FDI. The pre-crisis environment are relevant for policy responses because the weak macroeconomic positions, meaning fiscal deficits and current account deficits, mean that the government have limited fiscal space to implement interventions that could have cushioned the impact of the crisis, because they have no money, not enough money to scale up public health investments, to provide equipment for managing the crisis, to provide treatment. I am just hoping that when the global economy reopens again, we're not going to see a pickup of the infections in Africa, because I don't think the public health systems are prepared to manage the crisis. We have seen what happened what's happening in the US. Again, one of the most developed countries is unable to manage high infection rates, regardless of what's happening on the politics of it. We have limited capacity for governments to support households. In advanced economies, what has helped was unemployment compensation for people who are losing jobs, and also support for renters. For example, in the US, what has helped was the government has prevented landlords for evicting tenants who lose their jobs. I don't know what kind of capacity African countries have to support households, and that's why I'm emphasizing that prevention in the case of Africa is the best solution to manage the crisis. Again, weak macroeconomic conditions imply that the governments have limited capacity to implement interventions that are likely to support a speedy recovery. Weak recovery would mean that it would have undermined all the gains that African countries have made over the past decades. It's useful to think about how, again, we went from the early signs of the crisis. When the crisis hit in China, the encouraging thing is that African countries, the majority of African countries, showed awareness, and the governments showed awareness and willingness to intervene. Also, the lessons from the past were quite helpful. As the cases started emerging in African countries, mostly through what I call imported contagion. Again, willingness to act swiftly. Many countries closed the international travel and implemented the lockdown. But of course, I note some regrettable cases where African leaders denied the crisis. My own country, Burundi, the government went months denying that the country was facing any crisis. They thought that this is a crisis for Europe and the US. In Tanzania, I think it's still the case that the government doesn't believe in the crisis. They are basically emulating the US president and the Brazilian president, who still think that it's a mirage. Unfortunately, we have seen that the economic impact is piling up, increasing in many African countries, mostly through contraction of trade, contraction of tourism, contraction of capital flows. Unfortunately, African countries have very limited capacity to intervene. This is where we realize that it would have been really nice to have a strong regional integration system which would be a way of cushioning international negative shocks to international trade. the African countries also, as we have seen in the previous presentation, have not been effective in activating their fiscal policy and monetary policy. In fact, I would say that macroeconomic policy stimulus has been generally very weak. No support to the informal sector, even though we know that the majority of African population relies on informal sector for their income. This would be the time to really leverage public infrastructure investment, which can help create jobs and maintain incomes. Again, as I said, the majority of African countries have been willing to intervene, except some very bizarre reactions from in Tanzania and Burundi. The key challenge basically has been limited fiscal space, informal sector with precarious livelihoods, and inadequate international assistance for COVID interventions. Granted, developed countries are also managing their own challenges, and that limits the ability of African countries to intervene. This is shows you how African countries have been able to manage the crisis by controlling travel. Of course, it has economic impacts, but my sense is that you need to save human beings first, even if it means incurring negative economic impact. At the regional level, I want to just highlight a few initiatives that have been very instrumental in coordinating the response. One is the Africa Center for Disease and Control and Prevention, or CDC, which was very good at monitoring the contagion way back in January, and then convening meetings starting from February. The African Union has been very instrumental in mobilizing coordinated response at the continental level. There's a strategy, Africa Joint Continental Strategy for COVID, which was adopted in February by the AU heads of state, and has been put in place an African Task Force for Coronavirus, which is a collaborative effort by the Africa CDC, the AU members, and the WTO and other partners. And basically, the role is to spread out the information about the crisis and coordinate efforts at the national and regional level. I want to add the role of the African Development Bank, which has really mobilized its convening power and knowledge dissemination. I had a chance to review their revised African Economic Outlook that looked at the impact of the crisis. I think there is plenty of information that African government can use basically to see what are the likely impact of the crisis. Of course, the bank is the moment to leverage their capacity for counter-cyclical and emergency lending to African countries to help them weather the storm. In terms of global response, I have to say that yes, the WHO has been very active in mobilizing global support, both in information but also medical response. But I have a concern that there is not enough financial assistance coming.
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
From the global community, which which doesn't give enough space for African governments to intervene in supporting the public health crisis. You have heard about the debt relief that has been proposed by lenders, but some countries have been hesitant to take it up. And I understand that they know about the negative effects of a debt relief, especially from commercial lenders, which may have negative effects on the country ratings. But I think when it comes to public debt, my view would be that would be a good idea for government to take it up, because basically the choice is about having resources to be able to support counter-cyclical interventions support domestic demand so that you minimize the negative effects of the crisis and position yourself better for post-COVID recovery, versus refusing to take the debt relief, you spending your limited resources to pay the debt, and basically erodes your fiscal space to support economic recovery. It's a tough choice, but for me, I think any negative short-term effects of taking the debt relief are outweighed by long-term positive effects of positioning the economies better for recovering from the crisis. This is an opportunity for strengthening international cooperation. Unfortunately, this has been undermined by very counterproductive position of the US, which has taken a very isolationist approach, a very selfish approach. As I want to give a quotation from one of the politicians who lamented the position of the Trump regime, that saying that it won't protect American lives and interests, it leaves Americans sick and America alone. Some quickly to wrap up in terms of the lessons learned. One is early action is critical. The cost of late action is very high, and some of the consequences are irreversible. First of all, we're talking about a health crisis. So when a government does not react promptly, appropriately, human lives are lost, and those cannot be recovered. You can lose jobs, you can recover jobs, but you don't recover people who die. The crisis has been an opportunity for increasing investment in public health systems. Clearly, African health systems are inadequate. They don't have the capacity to manage the crisis. This is the moment to scale up public investment in health services. The crisis has demonstrated the importance of building capacity for counter-cyclical interventions, solid fiscal space, long-term savings, and especially saving for the future, including sovereign wealth funds and the like. It has demonstrated also the importance of economic intervention, economic diversification, both product diversification to cushion the impact of shocks, especially reducing the dependence on primary commodities, diversification of trade markets so that you are better protected from shocks to import markets. Again, I want to emphasize the need for domestic resource mobilization. African countries must graduate from aid dependence, and that's the best way to position themselves to intervene in the case of shocks. Thank you very much for listening. I wish I had more time, but I hope this is helpful.
Thank you very much, Léonce. I would like to just draw your attention before we move on to Duma, to Léonce's extensive work in the field of illegal financial flows from the continent. He's been very involved and has written a number of books on the matter. And I think this is something we could come back to in the discussion, because the question of illegal capital flight from the continent is one that should be taken up, particularly at this time. So over to you, Duma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this APORDE program. I want to speak. I've got quite a lot of slides, and I'm going to speak as fast as Niva Makretla and Patrick Bond, some of you might be aware of in South Africa, because I really think it's very important to talk about the context, the crisis that we find ourselves in. Now, basically, I want to start by saying, can you see me on the video? So I just want to say that in my little experience, what does it make for a country to become successful? The successful countries I've looked at have got a mobilizing vision and plan. Countries like China, Japan, South Korea, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. They've got the state capacity to initiate growth and development. They've got high rates of capital formation, 35 to 50%, in the case of China recently. And they achieve high levels of human development, education, and health. In education, we've seen countries like South Korea, and in terms of health, South Korea as well in terms of the COVID response. And obviously these countries are very expert at industrial upgrading and moving up from agriculture to industry to services and so forth. And in South Africa, after 1996, as Busi said, we had this gear macroeconomic policy. The first thing that the government did was decimate state capacity to initiate growth and development. They decimated public investment, so public investment in infrastructure, capital formation. They decimated spending on education and health, declined in per capita terms for the first decade of democracy. Industrial upgrading, there wasn't a formal industrial policy until 2007. And the industrial policy that has happened since then, it has provided limited policy tools and it's provided limited financing. In the last year, according to my calculation, the industrial financing portion is about 0.3% of GDP. Social protection, I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in South Africa, we need to extend our social security system to the working age population. And the key things that people talk about is the job guarantee and basic income. Now, these countries, mainly in Asia, they had a wider range of policy tools than Keynes. They had multiple tools, multiple targets and objectives. And I believe that inflation targeting, one target, one tool, is a primitive way of conducting your macroeconomic policy. There has to be close coordination of monetary, fiscal, industrial policies. And this has implications for the mandate and some independence of central banks. You know, I just want to talk about this because you hear the National Treasury, the government's propaganda, say we stabilized the apartheid. We inherited a budget deficit crisis. But I've looked at the numbers every single way you can. If you look at the third column, our debt to GDP ratio in 1996 when GEAR was introduced was 49.5% of GDP. That was not high by any standards. And our inflation rate was 7.3%. So you can't say that you stabilized the macroeconomic environment when there was nothing to stabilize in the first place. And the second thing, just a summary of our performance over the past 26 years of our democracy. GDP per capita is 28% higher than it was in 1994. In the same period, China's GDP is 760%, India's is up 300%. So GDP per capita over the past 26 years has increased by 1% a year. So there has been 4 phases in terms of this post-apartheid economy. The first phase is the GEAR phase that Busi was talking about. We had slash and burn monetary and fiscal policies. There were cuts in capital spending, I said, and interest rates went as high as 22%. Unemployment doubled to 8 million people from 4 million people. The second phase, we had a world equities and commodities boom. There was expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, interest rate drops sharply, and government spending increased sharply. And what we had was an investment boom of sorts when investment went to 23%, 1.5% of GDP from 16%. Now, people have erroneously said that our growth during this period was because of the global the global international commodity boom. That is not true, because if you look at the data closely, you'll see that mining GDP declined during that boom and mining employment declined. So mining and agriculture were the only sectors of the economy that didn't create jobs during that period. And most of the jobs were created, 3.1 million jobs were created during this period. And the unemployment rate went down to 28.7% from 40.6%. I just have to say that every sector of the economy created jobs except agriculture and mining. Then we have what is called a lost decade in terms of economic development, our failure to recover from the global financial crisis. I just looked at China and Ethiopia over the same period. They trebled the sizes of the economy. The politicians like to look at the global situation and come for excuses. And if you look, the emerging markets grew by 4.8%, emerging and developing Asia by 7% during this decade. But look at the bottom, South Africa grew by 1.4% and 0.1% in per capita terms. Then what the Communist Party in South Africa calls the crisis before the crisis? We had a crisis of collapsing GDP growth and rising unemployment. Unemployment increased by 4.9 million people since December 2008. We now have 10.8 million unemployed South Africans according to the expanded definition. 44% for Black Africans, 48% for Black African females, 49% in the Eastern Cape, where half of my family lives. The latest unemployment numbers are going to come in the next week or two, and we're going to see unemployment for Black Africans increase to well over 50% and well over 50% in the Eastern Cape. We had a 64% poverty rate for Black Africans, and many people know we are the most unequal country in the world. We had 5 years of declining GDP per capita between 2015 and 2019. We had 2 recessions in 2 consecutive years since Mr. Ramaphosa became president in 2018 and 2019. We had 3 consecutive quarters of declining GDP by March 2020 before COVID, and we're heading for the 3rd recession in 3 years. We had 6 out of 9 quarters of declining GDP and 7 out of 9 quarters of declining investments, despite 3 investment summits where huge pledges were made by the private sector. So we have now entered the 4th phase of the post-apartheid economy since March 2020. We're witnessing the shocks of a crisis I believe could eviscerate the dreams of our liberation. We have seen from the government a crony corona capitalism and vulgar neoliberalism, an obsession with inflation targets, irrelevant structural reforms, and unprecedented austerity of 600 billion that will deepen the depression and result in 3 years of declining GDP. Unemployment increased by 3 million people, and 2 million people, this is since lockdown, were women, according to the NIDS-CRAM survey. Unemployment, as I said, is heading towards 50%, at which point the whole society will be unviable. The social fabric of our society will be irreversibly scarred. The UNDP says it could take 5 years to reach 2019 levels of GDP, and NIDS-CRAM says the collateral damage could be with us for the next decade. So I just want to talk about the fiscal stimulus. So this is what President Ramaphosa announced on 21 April. Above the line was 260 billion, and you can see the line items, 100 billion for job creation, tax measures, grants, public health, municipalities, and 260 billion. So there was 5.1% of GDP. Below the line was the loan guarantee scheme that you see in many countries, and the UIF, the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which gave payments to people who were temporarily laid off. So now, this is what happened in the supplementary budget in June. The job creation, the government cut it to 6.1 billion from 100 billion, and there's no explanation of how this money would be spent. In Parliament yesterday, the government said Treasury said they've spent 1 billion, but they didn't explain what that 1 billion is. The tax measures, we found that it's not 70 billion, it's about 24 billion in terms of, most of it was tax deferrals. So, and then what we saw is that in the budget in February, we had 260 billion rands of cuts, 161 billion from the wage bill, 100 billion from allocations to provincial and local governments in the February budget. In the supplementary budget in June, we had further cuts of 100 billion rands, and the government has announced further cuts for 2022 and 2023 of 250 billion rand. So I think this unprecedented austerity, which is way in excess of what happened under Gear, will result in an unprecedented 3 years of declining GDP. Now, what is in the supplementary budget? The supplementary budget, I'll just provide 2 scenarios, which is one way of looking at it, what has happened since then. So above the line, it is 36 billion rands, 0.7% of GDP. This is what actually was announced. So that is based on COVID expenditure of 145 billion and cuts of 109 billion. So below the line, the loan guarantee was reduced to 100 billion rands by the banks. They said they can't handle anything more. And then on top of that, 2 days ago, I think on Friday last week, they announced that the guarantee has been reduced to 67 billion rands. And it's not really a stimulus. The Banking Association have announced 13.6 billion rands of loans that have been announced. There has been they say they're reaching the peak of the loans that they can provide at 13.6 billion. There has been no additionality because the banks have used their normal credit criteria, and the people who got the loans would have got the loans in any way. So I believe that what we're seeing here is we shouldn't count this loan guarantee as part of a fiscal stimulus, as part of the stimulus package, because it will have no impact on the economy. And the people, so we saw recently that the private sector credit extension has been falling precipitously. So this loan guarantee will play no role in terms of influencing private sector credit extension, which is the one that follows GDP growth. So I would say, so if you look at it this way, this scenario, the budget, the stimulus package is 3.5% of GDP, 0.7% below the line, and 2.7% of GDP above the line. I'm getting confused. And then the second way of looking at it, this is the way I see it. I've taken out the loan guarantee because I don't think there's no, it is not part of the stimulus. It has been a complete failure. So above the line, it is 16.4 billion based on what the government presented to Parliament yesterday. So the COVID allocations of 125 billion, excluding provisional allocations to job creation. So then you get to a figure of 16.4 billion, 0.3% of GDP. So in Parliament yesterday, government says they've only spent 18 billion rands in 5 months, 15% of the 122.4 billion that was allocated. So at this stage, the government will probably not spend the entire 16.4 billion by the end of the year. So, the UIF has spent the entire 40 billion rands, and there was a slow start to the UIF, but we can say it was moderately successful. So according to my calculation, this fiscal stimulus was not 10% of GDP, it was 1.1% of GDP. And many South Africans have been trying to work out what happened to this fiscal stimulus. And quickly, I just want to say, if you look at the bottom, in March 2020, that was our gross debt to GDP ratio, 63.5%. Net was 58.4%. I'm comparing with the debt to GDP ratio, the most recent IMF, the last IMF report of 2019. The world average was 83%. India, much higher than us. So our debt to GDP ratio was not high by any reasonable measure in March 2020, but the government wants us to believe that we were already in a fiscal crisis. But I just have to say quickly about this debt. It has increased from 22% in 2008 to 63.5%, but most of this has been due to slow growth and failure to reach revenue targets, and not because of overspending by the government. So now the IMF says in the latest, what's this fiscal monitor report, that the average debt to GDP ratio will increase by 18 percentage points to about 103% of GDP. And in South Africa, our debt to GDP will increase by exactly 18 percentage points to 81% of GDP. So in relative terms, we are going to be exactly where we were before the crisis compared to other crises, because every single country in the world had exactly the same shock that we've had. So I just want to say South Africa also has we have to look at the whole SA Inc. balance sheet. Net loan debt about 3 trillion, our electricity company about 500 billion. But the PIC, our state pension fund, has got assets of about 2 trillion, that's a bit dated. The foreign exchange reserves at the central bank is about 1 trillion rands, and our cash balance is about 260 billion rand according to the latest budget. Now, quickly, I just want to talk about the Public Investment Corporation. It's a defined benefit fund, and our former finance minister said it would be inappropriate to consider any returns from such investments to be benefiting the beneficiaries. This is because the pension benefits are predetermined. So they're just government's way of financing its obligation to the employees. And so if the value of the assets goes up or goes down, it has no impact on the final pension. And I don't believe that the assets in the PIC are owned by the workers. This is a scenario, firstly, with the current situation. The fully funded pension fund, you'll see that the total contributions in 2018-2009 were 76 billion rands by the employer and the employees. And the investment income was 84 billion, and the total revenue was 160 billion. So the total expenditure was 102 billion, and this is after massive improvements in the benefits that were made to the pensioners in 2012, 2013. So the fund have an annual surplus of 57.3 billion. And I think it's complete madness to be accumulating the assets at such a massive pace. As you can see, over the past 6 years, we've been accumulating these surpluses at about 50 billion rands a year on average in the past 6 years. So this is a scenario where I say, let us slash the assets in this pension fund. It is 100% funded, and there is no need for fully funded pension fund, because there is no scenario where, like a private company, the government will have to pay every single 1.3 million public servants to go away on the same day. So if we do it prudently and we slash to 50% of the assets, you see that there's still an annual surplus of 15.2 billion. And this is the scenario that shows what would have happened to that annual surplus if we'd done it 6 years ago. So I think that one of the people say this is a crisis like no other. It demands a response like no other. And I believe that at least halving this is a compromise, because some of us would believe actually that we should return to a pay-as-you-go pension fund. But a compromise that I think many people can accept if they understand what I'm saying is that we can reduce the funding in the public. So what are our options? The government, what they've done is they've cut interest rates by 275 basis points at the central bank. They've purchased government debt on the secondary market. I can't remember the latest figure, but it was about 20 to 30 billion rands. Is it 0.5% of GDP? I can't remember the exact number. So that's what they've done. And they actually managed to boss the bond market. You remember that there was that spike in March, and our cost of capital has come down by, I think, more than 300 basis points. And today on the bond market, interest, they went very, very low 10-year bond yields. I'm very sympathetic to modern monetary theory. A sovereign state which issues its own currency cannot fail to meet its obligations in its own currency unless it chooses to do. In South Africa, we've got the unique privilege of having 90% of our debt is issued in domestic currency. We've got 1 trillion rand of foreign exchange reserves. This is 1 year of forecast imports versus an international benchmark of 3 months. I believe we can release about half of these reserves into the economy. We can also recapitalize our development finance institutions. We can have developmental windows for the banks to lend to priority sectors. But I'm not sure about that now that we have the situation with the loan guarantee scheme. We can also have monetary financing of ESCOM debt and government spending. The PIC, as I said, I believe that if we cut our assets by half, by 50%, we can write off state debt of 500 billion rands. We can write off state-owned company debt of, including the ESCOM debt of 200 billion rands, and use cash of 140 billion rand to fund the fiscal stimulus and convert these assets into infrastructure and so forth. So we can release assets of about 900 billion rands from this public investment corporation. And then there's a whole debate in South Africa around prescribed assets. I'm not so sure about it anymore, the way it's going, because it seems we're going to have a soft obligation. We've got deep capital markets, 9 trillion rand of industry assets and retirement funds and life insurance. And the ANC has been talking about using these assets for development for 26 years. It was in the Reconstruction Development Program. And what kind of ruling party can debate something for 26 years? And if you look at the latest government, the government plan for recovery, it rests on a single idea, new idea, a single idea which is not new, is that we must use these assets for development. But in theory, if we have some kind of prescription, 10% of industry assets towards developmental investments, we could release a lot of money over the next few years. So this is just some of the principles. If we think innovatively, we can finance a massive fiscal stimulus. The last slide, this is what I believe we should do as South Africans. We should have a dignity floor below which no South African will fall. We have to have the basic income grants. As I said, unemployment is reaching 50%. At that point, there is no option but to have a basic income grant. And you can talk about job creation. To halve the unemployment rate, we need to create about 8 million jobs. And you are never, even if you implement everything that I say, you are never going to achieve like more than 1.5 million jobs, net job creation a year. So I think it's ludicrous to people to be saying that people talk up. So so in terms of the basic income grant, we must look at the net cost after taking into account the benefits of higher growth and tax revenues. The first year, I believe, has to be funded through monetary financing. There is or debt, or what, there's only one option. So what people are coming up with in terms of this big, I've seen some of the presentations, they try to make the big smaller, but we need a fiscal stimulus. They try to create a budget neutral big, but a budget neutral big does not have a stimulus. So I believe that the first one has to, it has to be financed either through, the first year has to be financed through monetary financing and also through debt creation. So we also have to repurpose the UIF, but I won't talk about that because I've got some ideas on that, because the benefits paid by our unemployment insurance funds were too low compared to the incomes that the people were earning. But there are many ways in which we can copy some of the models that you saw in the rest of the world, like in Germany, to develop, because these crises of global capitalism, they're more frequent, and we should never, ever leave our people so exposed to the ravages of a climate crisis, could be next time, or a financial crisis, or any other crisis. We could have a commodity crisis next time. So we have to increase the resilience of our society. And the health pandemic has said we must implement our national health insurance. I've done a back of the envelope calculation. What if we could reach 2/3 of per capita private sector expenditure? That would require about 300 billion rands a year. And I think we must equalize our two health systems. It is unacceptable and something that can't continue. And there are ways of financing that. I just looked at, if you did a payroll tax for the employee and the employer of 5% each, using the figures that we already know from the skills levy, that would raise about 200 billion rands a year. So what we should do, I believe that we must implement it like yesterday, and we must equalize the two health systems. I live near Bedfordview in South Africa, in the east part of Johannesburg, and there's no reason why anybody can't go to our local private hospital and so forth. Then we have to have free education, basic and tertiary. Now, if we have to, I did a scenario where the learner education ratio in private schools must be equal to the ones in the public schools. So that requires 300,000 new teachers and for us to almost double the number of classrooms. So I believe that one of the most painful periods of this lockdown is because the rich children in the private schools, 4% of children continued learning as if nothing had happened. And the poor kids could not go back to school. And that is really the most painful. And if that is okay for many South Africans, I think it's the most painful thing that so many of the people in the public schools could not continue learning. And finally, there are many options around the Green New Deal to drive infrastructure spend and industrialization. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Duma. And I'm not sure what Neva will say about the speed, but we'll leave that for question time. Thanks very much for a very rich, not only a very rich critique of what South Africa's stimulus comprised of and did not comprise of, but also an incredible amount of detail on what we can do or what could be done, which I think is really very encouraging if we just had some ears that would listen. So let's move now to questions. We can take questions if people would like to raise their hands. There are a couple of questions on the Q&A, which I'm going to start off with. And yeah, so let's take the questions on the Q&A first while people think about what they want to ask. Okay, the first question I think was to Busi, which I think everybody could respond. Let me just see. That question seems to have disappeared. Right. Okay, so there was a question on you indicated that government intends cutting the budget by 5%, 6%, and 7% in the next 3 years. Are there reasons advanced by government for that? And do you accept or reject such reasons and why? Okay, I see Busi has answered that online. A second question there, what is your comment on the recent interest rate cuts Do you think they are significant enough in supporting households and the economy in this COVID-19 period? I think we can take everybody's responses to that. From Siraj, there is a view in South Africa that public debt levels can be increased without increasing foreign borrowing by using the full extent of the balance sheet available to the state. In other words, to the use of the excess funds of the PIC and UIF to finance government spending and, importantly, direct purchase of government debt by the central bank. Would these options be possible in other African countries as well? We've had some discussion about it here. All right, so if we first of all take, okay, I see there's one other question for Léonce. Sorry, I don't see that question. Okay, a question directed to Duma. What percentage of the PIC is invested domestically and what percentage offshore? Right, so let's take those questions first of all, and then we'll see if there are hands after that. Who would like to start? Busi, can you start off?
Sure, thank you. I started answering it, but it was quite a short answer, and I think certainly can go deeper. I think
just elaborate.
We are. So I think the interest rate cuts have been particularly beneficial to our economy, and they were needed in a way. And in fact, I think SARB is acting beyond what I would have anticipated given their conservative approaches, and that the interest rate cuts have demonstrated very strongly that SARB is capable of decreasing its own borrowing or the government's borrowing costs, which is something that has been spoken about quite widely, that South Africa's yields are quite high. And so we need to start thinking about, given that our debt is actually only 10% international foreign currency, and majority of it is domestically raised, why is it that our cost of borrowing as government rather is so high? And I think the interest rates intervention has demonstrated that there are tools to be able to tackle this high borrowing costs. But also I think that, like as I indicate there, that our South African Reserve Bank is definitely underutilized. And what I mean by that is that there are many monetary policy tools that could be considered and implemented, and that in fact the inflation targeting approach and the way that, like I said, has been conservatively seen as by the SARB, that we're underutilizing these tools. And recently it was interesting because the governor of SARB said that we need structural reform in the economy. And whenever he speaks about structural reform, it's always about what Treasury needs to do, what fiscal policy needs to do. And really is it about what reform does SARB need to undertake in itself as an institution to be able to facilitate the developmental goals of the state itself. And so that's my sense of that.
Many thanks, Busi. Léonce, would you like to respond to some of the questions?
Yes. There was some a very good question from Siraj, who is better positioned to answer the question than I am. But he raises a very important question, which is about whether the government actually has space to expand its borrowing capacity without breaching the risk thresholds, especially vis-a-vis international debt. My own analysis, again, just as a way of commercials, we have just recently produced a research paper on capital flight from South Africa, which is posted on our website. I can send everybody the links if they want to look at it. And in that, we have a section that analyzes the issue of government debt. External debt basically is a new phenomenon, is a recent phenomenon in South Africa. It starts from the end of the apartheid regime, but you can see that it has risen significantly. The statistics I'm able to see from the South African Reserve Bank is that basically now the domestic debt and external debt are at the same level. So the question is that the cost of borrowing is actually as high for domestic and foreign. This is it's something that it's a misconception that people may want to despair, that the notion that domestic debt is cheaper than external debt. It's not actually true. If you look at the true cost of borrowing in many African countries, it's higher for domestic debt than for foreign, which brings you to the role of monetary policy, because the cost of borrowing is high because interest rates are way too high. So the government is paying a high interest rate on its borrowing, and it's reducing its capacity to actually take advantage of domestic borrowing and to finance its expenditures. I agree with Siraj that there is room for the South African Reserve Bank to do more in terms of buying government debt as a way of shoring up domestic liquidity, also supporting government expenditure plans. I think my view is that the South African Reserve Bank has been too conservative, in the sense that of maybe they have an eye on the inflation target, which to me is too low. And to me, the crisis is not the time to target the inflation. It's the time to allow deficit spending so that the government can support domestic demand and reduce the impact of the crisis and position the country to recover better. I keep saying people do not eat inflation. People need to be able to spend. People need to be able to consume. If in fact the increased government spending is going to push inflation a little bit higher than the target, that's the cost of supporting the economy through the crisis. But I don't think that the main risk now is inflation. The main risk now is depressed domestic demand, which is going to keep the economy falling again back into a recession. I would invite actually a strong discussion on the role of the central bank to be more aggressive in supporting domestic demand and in reducing the cost of borrowing for the government, and in utilizing its capacity to buy government securities to beef up the liquidity in the market. Thank you.
Thank you. On the Reserve Bank.
Duma?
Yeah, on the Reserve Bank, I've been running a one-man campaign against monetary policy for a long time in South Africa. And I've written so many articles about this. And I believe that the Reserve Bank, I can't understand, in every single speech he's had since the pandemic, he has talked only about inflation. He doesn't mention anything else except inflation. It is complete insanity. And the interest rate cuts that is announced are way too little given the scale of the epidemic we have. There is no reason, as I said in my presentation, for interest rates not to come to zero. And we can also reduce the yield, the differential between the prime lending rate and the zero interest rates. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that there's so much more that the Reserve Bank can do. It talks about inflation all the time and so forth. They can also provide, together with the PIC, to answer Siraj's question, the budget deficit this year is 760 billion rands. The central bank and the PIC can be on standby to purchase the government bonds and finance the entire 760 billion rands. Let me just tell people, maybe the non-South Africans here, is that our unemployment insurance fund in March 2020 had a surplus of 150 billion rands. Now, in NEDLAC, which is a multi-stakeholder bargaining council to talk about the economy between labor, business, and whatever, and community constituencies, there was a debate around this, and the government could not put a single reason as to why we had to have a 150 billion rand surplus at the unemployment insurance fund. Now, because they couldn't come up with a reason, they decided to spend 40 billion rands of that surplus providing benefits to people who had been temporarily laid off. But now, after those payments, we still have a surplus of 100 billion rands. And throughout this crisis, I've been talking to the Unemployment Insurance Fund, debating them about what they're doing and so forth. But it is absolutely insane that we should be having a surplus of so much. And also the level of funding in the Public Investment Corporation, as I've talked about. There's space for us for that to be used for a once-off restructuring of the SA Inc. balance sheet by reducing state-owned company debt and also the government debt of about 700 billion rands. Yeah. So in terms of the PIC's assets, most of them are invested domestically, more than 90%. There's very little they've got an Africa strategy, but it has invested very little in other African countries. Yeah. And I just have to mention something about this, is that the current head of the PIC used to be the head of the Government Employees Pension Fund. And late last year, he argued that we should allow them to invest more money offshore because our economy is collapsing. Now, you can't have a state institution arguing to externalize capital away from South Africa, our seedling. And so this guy is now the head of the Public Investment Corporation, and he will probably be calling for more investment offshore. Yeah, that's my answer to the three questions.
Two-hander. Do you
Thanks
have
very much, Duma.
Is there any reference for that policy approach by the PIC to invest offshore? Because I would like to pursue that, because one of the things we do in our study is to look at outflows from Africa, both official and unofficial. But of course, there is a big issue of illicit financial flows from the country. But it is also there is an issue of unwise investment offshore, as opposed to which should be invested domestically. So that would be really unfortunate that a public institution is preferring foreign assets to domestic investment, because my sense is that the returns to investment are much higher in South Africa than in those offshore markets where they get nothing almost in terms of the returns.
Léonce, I once interviewed them a couple of years ago about their Africa strategy. And I just have to mention that the biggest investment was in Dangote cement.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that is absurd. But anyway.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm quite mindful of the time. It's getting, we're running out of time, but I'm going to take one more round of questions. I think I've got 3 more questions on the Q&A that I'm going to read out from Witness to Duma. What success can you attribute to the IPAP, that's the Industrial Policy Action Plan, over the past 10 years? And also, by how much do you think it was underfunded? And then a question from Imran. What is the view on nationalization of the SARB, that's the South African Reserve Bank, as a measure of addressing some of the developmental objectives of the state? From Siraj again to Léonce, do you expect capital flight from African countries to increase as a result of COVID-19? In light of the effects of COVID-19, illicit financial flows will probably mean a reduction of wealth, not income flows, by the rich in Africa, in flight to other countries, as well as stealing from foreign debt, including foreign debt, inflows, to deal with COVID-19 to finance these outflows. Sorry, I don't think I read that very well. Right, so we've got 2 questions that are focused pretty much on South Africa, and the third one directed at Léonce. So let's first ask Busi if she would like to respond, and then Duma, and then we'll take the capital flight question. But please do comment on the capital flight question as well if you wish to, Busi and Duma. Thank you. Busi?
Can I come back, because I'd actually like to respond on the capital flight one, particularly in relation to the illicit financial flows. So I'll let the others go first.
Sure.
Okay, I'll start.
Okay. Duma, would you like to respond to the question on IPAP and the question on the nationalization of the Reserve Bank?
Okay, on IPAP, there's an economist, the treasurer at DTI, he's shown that the IPAP has the funding towards IPAP has reduced by 18% until 2009. So it's been decreasing since 2014, 2015. So if you look at the total outlays in 2019, I did an analysis of this from the IDC plus the industrial financing of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. It adds up to only 0.3% of GDP. It shouldn't even count to be called an industrial policy. It is so little. And on top of that, the tools that they use are so limited. They don't use any macroeconomic policy tools to achieve their objectives. The Reserve Bank is not involved. And I don't think it will have any impact on changing the structure of the economy. It's too little, and there's too little tools. In terms of the SARB, there's a political debate in South Africa. So my argument, it's been quite simple. We can nationalize the central bank, and the only reason, and this time I agree with the ANC, they say it's an anomaly, and the only reason that we can and we should do it, according to, and people must understand it, is because we can. Yeah. It would cost, the value of the shares is the amount of a house in Hyde Park in South Africa. So the government must make an offer at a reasonable premium to that house of about 20 million rands. And if 80% of people accept, and they must get investment bank to make an offer to all the shareholders. And if they accept at 50 million rands or 75 million rands, then they can go back to their branches and say, sorry, but only 60% accepted. But I think it's a stupid debate. We actually have to change the mandate of the central bank to include development and to include economic growth, development, employment, gender equality, racial equality, and so forth. We have to give it a much wider mandate than it is at the moment. So I would support the nationalization of the Reserve Bank if it's accompanied by a change in the mandate. But we need a roots and branch restructuring of the central bank and also the National Treasury. I just have to mention one point about National Treasury. Last weekend, on Sunday, there were rumors that the finance minister was going to resign because the president had reprimanded him after making comments about Zambian president firing the central bank governor. And you realize that if they change him, it won't make a difference because the institution is so insanely conservative. In fact, from the previous finance ministers, the message is exactly the same. And I can assure you that no matter who takes over, if we don't change those two institutions, we will not see any changes in terms of our economic policy in South Africa. But I think that the only way to change, in terms of this pandemic, the president is on a dead end. As long as he has the finance minister and the central bank governor, we are going nowhere fast.
Thanks very much. Busi, do you want to come in now on the financial flows?
I've changed my mind. I wanted to piggyback off of what Duma said because it really resonates. I think the issue of policy coordination is one that really is critical in this moment and something that it really needs remedy. And when we think about what do we want the South African Reserve Bank to do? And I think sometimes the questions aren't really as a dichotomy as we think they are, right? Sometimes people are like, is it privatization? Is it not? But really the questions should be, what is it that we want our fiscal policy to do in our country? What is it that we want our monetary policy to do? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve? And how do we arrive at those goals using the policies that we have? Because I think that sometimes it goes the other way around, right? It's a stable macroeconomic environment for a developing country is not the answer. And I think that, and just to take it even broader, to say that policy coordination is the lack of it is really showing even in our COVID response. If you look at how are all our policies speaking to each other? And I'll give an example with going back to school. So schools are still closed, but parents are expected to go to work. Fiscal policy is doing something, monetary policy is doing another thing. And the question ultimately is that, how are we coordinating all these policies together? Because as we know, as students of economics, we know that monetary and fiscal policy go hand in hand, but yet we continuously get this narrative that the SARB is independent, that SARB is doing its own thing and SARB is its own entity. But also in a country where we've got developmental agendas, we cannot afford to have SARB be an independent entity that has its own goal of solely stabilization of, well, inflation, right? Like ensuring that inflation is low, whereas we needed to do more than that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Busi. Before I give you the last word, Léonce, I just want to add a final question. From a continental perspective, what's the proportion of pension and sovereign wealth funds invested offshore globally as opposed to on the continent? So there were two questions for Léonce, just to wrap up. Firstly, the one about the capital flight, whether that would be aggravated as a result of COVID-19. And then secondly, about pension and sovereign wealth funds off the continent versus on the continent. And then we will close after that.
Okay, so do I have like about an hour and a half to answer this?
3 minutes.
Yeah, so once again, on the capital flight question, I really invite people to read our paper, which is posted on the Perry website. We're working on a book which will come out hopefully next year. Not hopefully, surely next year. So again, Siraj is really hiding behind the screen to ask me questions he should be answering himself. He presented that dissertation on the topic, so he's the expert on the topic. But I think the point, the question he raises is very, very important about the implication of the crisis for capital flight and illicit financial flows. He raises a concern which is very critical about the use of external debt, which has been one of the ways in which capital flight has been funded. When government borrowing comes into Africa, is embezzled and goes back into offshore financial centers, and sometimes doesn't even come to the country. And we have seen complaints about misuse and lack of transparency of the use of the COVID money that's coming into the countries, and that's one of the ways in which that money can leak out of the countries in the form of capital flight. The other concern that we may have is with the increase in uncertainty in African economies, that this can induce private asset holders to invest abroad. And we were already talking about public institutions preferring to invest abroad as opposed to investing domestically. And you can imagine that this could also be done illicitly. On the pool side, of course, the offshore financial centers are very happy to welcome any money that comes from the continent, especially now that the money is on the short side. They will be happy to induce and encourage that. Regarding so again, I can say more about this if I had time. Regarding sovereign wealth funds, first of all, sovereign wealth funds are something that should be rise higher on the policy agenda for African countries, because they are one of the ways in which countries prepare themselves for managing the crisis by putting money aside when there is during expansion and commodity booms, and be able to use that during recovery. I haven't done a detailed study on on sovereign wealth funds, but I can almost expect that the majority of the funds are invested abroad in the international markets. And also, if you went into the details of the central banks and look at how their reserves are invested, how their assets are invested, again, in international markets, and how much money, how much interest are they getting? Very, very little. So I think there is a need to open a discussion about how African countries are investing their hard-earned savings, which are in sovereign wealth funds and in central bank reserves. I think an amount which is way too high is invested in international markets where they don't earn enough returns, and whereas the countries are begging for more money for investing in public infrastructure in social and health sectors. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Léonce. And I would like to move to close the session now. I've put the link for the PERI website on the chat so that you can follow up on that paper. And I would like to just thank all three of our speakers for a very rich and stimulating discussion and a lot to take forward from there. I'd like to just hand over to Saul to close and announce our next session next week.
Thanks, Nikki, and thank you to the panelists. I really enjoyed that session. I think it raises very key issues that we'll take forward. We will contact all three of you to get the presentations, and we'll post them if they're available. We can then post them on the TIPS website. And we are able to have the next sessions next week at 2:30 on Monday and 3:30 on Tuesday. Social responses to COVID-19 on Monday, and income inequality on Tuesday with Gabriel Palmer, Neva Machetla, and Basani Baloy. So we look forward to seeing you all next week and to continue with this year's APORDE virtually. Thanks very much to everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you, Léonce.
Bye. And thanks again for
inviting.
Thank you,
Duma and Busi. Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye.